Hey everyone, there we are. Hey, Wilhelm Alcivar here to bring you another lesson from Zip Code Wilmington. Zip Code Wilmington is a nonprofit school for code where we can train you for in a 3-month program that can bring you from no experience to coding professional. Go check out zipcodewilmington.com to learn more and apply today. Also, make sure to go check us out on social media and follow us here on Twitch. At ZipCodeWilm on Twitter and Instagram, and ZipCode Wilmington on Facebook. With that out of the way, let's get started. So today, we are actually going to be talking about the front-end framework AngularJS. Now, AngularJS is a front-end framework that's built around the concept that everything is going to be a component. And a component is just a small, bite-sized piece of a web page that we can reuse on different spots. Now, you're probably used to interacting with components, but you might not recognize them if you don't know what to look out for. So, let's jump right into it. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is make sure that I'm using Node.js. All right. I'm going to use the most up-to-date version I have available to me by saying nvm use node, and I'll be using Node version 12.4 and npm version 6.9. So if you want to follow along with me, just make sure that you use those versions. Any version past Node 10 should work functionally the same, but it might be just a little bit different. All right. Next, I'm going to have to actually install Angular. Now, installing Angular is really easy. We're actually going to do it using what's called the Angular CLI. So to do that, I'm going to type in the command npm install-g at Angular/CLI, and I'm going to hit enter. Now, anyone with any experience with NPM knows this is going to take a while. So while that's happening, I'm going to go ahead and explain just what we're going to go over today. So, that was a little faster than expected. So today, we are going to be going over making just some components. Now, what a component is it's just a little piece of a web page that we're going to want to try and reuse. Now, you might recognize components, and in fact, you can probably see them on your Twitch page right now. All of the individual sections of your screen right now, the video, that sidebar, even the individual chat messages are just components that are being reused over and over again inside of the code in the back end. So let's actually just go ahead and create a project. So I'm going to go into my projects folder here now that my Angular CLI is installed. And I am going to use Angular CLI in order to create a new project. So the project that we're going to create, I'm just going to call my Angular project. The command is going to be ng new, and then the name of your project. So I'm going to call it my Angular project. Going to hit enter. It's going to ask me if I would like to add a bunch of different things like Angular routing. I am just going to say default for all of these. I'll use CSS, and I'll let it do its thing. Again, it's going to take a while. Basically, what it's doing is it's collecting all of the packages that I need in order to create a website and bundling them all up into a new folder here. The folder it's going to create will match the name of the project, and it's going to be called My Angular Project. So today, I figured a pretty good example would be making an admin portal. So we're just going to make a portal where we can see a list of users, and we are going to see if their emails are verified, and we're also going to be able to remove them if any of them look a bit suspicious to us. All right, so we'll give this a few more minutes or seconds, however long this takes, and we should be good to get started here. Of course, now this is where it takes time. Great. So our backend today is actually not going to be functional. So we're actually going to be using mock data. This mock data is going to be just something that we're going to plug in into our front end. And if you wanted to expand on this project, then you could actually start using HTTP request in order to hook into that backend. All right, so with that done now, we should have my Angular project. There it is right there. I have a bunch of other different projects here. You can mostly just ignore those. So let's go ahead and go into my Angular project, and let's open this up. So looking around here, we have a lot of stuff. We'll full screen this. So we have a lot of different folders right now and a lot of different files. A lot of these files are actually configuration files written in JSON, and we can mostly just ignore these for the most part. This also comes with a couple files that we might want to take a look at if we want to understand our project to the fullest. The first one here is package.json. Now, package.json is a pretty standard file in most Node.js projects. So this file is actually going to tell us everything that we can do with the projects with this script section, and it's going to tell us that everything our project needs in order to run properly. In this case, you can see most of the dependencies that we have are Angular dependencies. So these are other packages that the Angular community has created. And then we have stuff here called dev dependencies. Now, these dev dependencies are basically packages that we'll need when our program is in development. So at the moment, we'll need all of these. But when we push these to production, then we're not going to need this in order to serve our website. So if you're curious about any of these, then you should just read up on them. There are a couple of really great ones. Jasmine and Karma, for example, is a good testing framework that comes shipped with Angular. TS-lint is a good program that actually allows us to debug our code while we're developing. And TypeScript is actually the language that we're going to be using today. So believe it or not, our actual language itself is a dependency. All right. On top of having this file, we also have a file here called, and where is it? karma.conf.js. So if you're interested in testing your framework or testing your website, this is one of the first files that you'll want to go and check out. Karma.js is .js is going to be where we talk about how we test our website. Within here, you'll see some settings like port settings, colors, log level, and all of this kind of stuff is just going to explain to your application how to run tests. Now, inside of these folders here, you'll also start to get some other good stuff. Node modules here, this folder specifically is where all of our dependencies are kept. You'll notice the very top one here is @Angular. This actually has all of the standard packages that belong to Angular. Down here are other packages that Angular depends on, and some dev packages that we need while we're developing. Most of the times you kind of want to not edit anything in Node modules. There might be some exceptions to that if you're developing a package, but usually just stay out of that one. The folder that we're actually going to care about today is going to be this SRC folder, or the source code folder. Within that source code folder, we're actually going to write all of our application logic and serve up all of our content. All right. And speaking of serving up all of our content, I said before, we have a fully functional Angular application. So what does that look like out of the box? Well, we have to actually serve this content using a command that comes with the Angular CLI. So back here in my terminal, I am going to use a command, ng-serve. And this command is going to build all of the Angular assets that I have, put them on a web page, and allow me to view them on my local computer. So this is going to take a second while it builds. You'll see it says it's compiling assets here. And then once it's done compiling these assets, it's going to start up a web browser. By default, that web browser will be at localhost 4200. You are able to change that if you want to change your configuration, but usually that is a okay place to serve the website. So while we let this build, we will go over here into our Firefox browser. I'm going to type in localhost colon 42,000. And here I have an Angular project. And actually, this is very zoomed in. So the Angular project here that comes with Angular CLI by default is actually just a little welcome page, which is kind of nice. It also has some introductory tutorials that you can go check out. I highly recommend trying out Tour of Heroes if you want to continue developing with Angular. Tour of Heroes is actually a really great tutorial, and it'll go in depth on a lot of the topics that I'm talking about today. So with this out of the way, we might want to start writing our own code here. So to start writing our own code, we have to go back to our project and look for where that is. Now, it turns out that this application is underneath this app folder under our source folder. Specifically, this component, app.component.html. So what we can tell by that, and because we recognize that component word, that actually the way Angular comes out of the box is this whole website here is our first component. Inside of here, we have information about what's on the page. You can see here it says here are some links to help you get started. Over here, we can see that text right there. If we want to edit some of this, so here's some links to help you start. I can say help you get started because that's the verbiage I like better. And you'll see it update over here. Now, this content is just something that comes out of the box. So we oftentimes will just want to go ahead and jump into this and remove it. That's okay to remove everything because we are just going to get started with our own stuff here. So I'm going to put right at the top of this an h1 tag. And inside of this h1 tag, I'm just going to say, hello, Angular app. Go back over here, and I should see this refresh. And there I have my first Angular app, my first amount of content in here. Now, this is really cool, but maybe we can add some functionality to this to make this actually kind of useful. So I said before, we're going to be making a user management app. And in order to do that, we're going to have to think out a few things that we'll probably need. The first thing that we'll actually need is probably just a way to display users themselves. So we can actually do that by creating a user component. Once a user component is created, then we can place users on the page. So let's go ahead and do that. Back over in my terminal here, I'm going to let this keep running, and I'm going to open up a new window. And so you can see over here, this is still running. I'll come back to it later. And over here in my new window, I am going to go into my Angular project. So I'll go into projects, my Angular project. And now that I'm here, I am going to create a new component. Now, just like other things that we can create using Angular CLI, we can actually generate a component. The command for doing that is going to be ng generate component. Now, the component that I'm going to be creating is going to be called a user. Most of the times when you name components, you just want to call them based on what will be inside of those. So ng generate component user is going to be something that is responsible for holding user data. Now, back over here underneath source app, in my editor over here, you see there's a new folder here called user. Within that, I have 4 different files. I have the user component.css. This is where I'm going to write content styles that will style my page. I also have the user component.html. This will be where I put HTML that is relevant to the user. Then I have user component spec.ts. this is actually going to be what you use in order to write tests for your front-end framework. I am actually not going to go over testing today, but it's something that you should definitely take a look at if you're interested in writing production-level Angular apps. Then lastly, we have the user component.ts. This is the actual TypeScript code that will represent a user and allow us to actually create content on our front end. So, where do we get started? Well, first of all, we can look at something in this file. We see we have a selector here, app user. That selector is indicating that if we put that selector as a tag anywhere else in our application, we'll have a copy of this component. And the component will basically just look like whatever's in here. So if I go back to my app component.html and I put in app-user and I put in a slash here. So now I've used the selector here. I go back over to my web browser and I see this message, user works. So it says user works there because that's the HTML here in my user component.html. If I change the content to that, so I might change that to something like I am a user, and I come back over here, I'll see I am a user. Now, if I want to have multiple users, I can just put more app user tags in there. So now I have 5 users in here, and thus I have 5 users over here. And so now I have a reusable component. But again, this is still not very useful because I'm still not keeping track of user data. In order to keep track of user data, I'm probably going to need a user object in order to actually style some of this stuff. So, in order to do that, I'm of course going to go back over to my terminal, and I am going to generate. What am I going to generate? I am going to generate a class. There it is. So ng generate class user. Now this user class can actually be used to store data about a user. Back over here in my editor, I'll notice down here that there's actually a new class here called user.ts. That's under the source folder. So there is src/app/user.ts. Within this user.ts, I can actually put in information that is relevant to the users using my application. So let's think of some data that might be relevant here. Well, users are going to have usernames. So I'll give this user a username. In TypeScript, we put in the name of a variable, and then a colon, and then the variable type. So I'm going to put in string here. So this is going to be a string user. And actually, sorry, my Java is getting to me. This should be a lowercase s string. Next, a user is going to have an email that they registered with. So I'm going to go ahead and add email. Then they're going to have an actual name that we'll call them by. So we'll put in name string. And the last thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to have a flag that indicates whether or not the user verified their email address. So we're going to have a Boolean here called verified. And I'll just set that to Boolean. All right. From here, we're going to have to create a constructor. So in TypeScript, again, in order to create a constructor, all we're going to do is we're going to use the constructor keyword. Open this up like a function, and then we can put content in here. Now, the content that I want to pass into this constructor is going to be all of this up here. So in order to construct a user, I need a username, type string, an email of type string, a name of type string, and lastly, a verified of type Boolean. And then I can just go down here and say this dot username equals username, this dot email equals email, this dot name equals name, and this dot verified equals verified. So now I actually have an object that can store user data. So let's go into our user component.html and indicate that we are going to want a user, or our user component.ts, and indicate that we're going to want a user in order to pass to our HTML. So back over here, I'm going to go over to my user.component.ts, and I'm going to say that there's going to be a class variable here called user, and it's going to be of type user. Now, you'll notice I'm getting a red squiggle. This user class cannot be found. What I'm going to have to do before I can use this is import it. Up here at the top, I can do that simply by saying import user from, and then I give it the relative path from this file location. The relative path in this case is going to be /user, and then semicolon at the end here, and now I am able to use my user. So once the user is created, it wants to be passed in. In order to indicate to TypeScript that I want to pass this in as a property, I can actually use a directive from Angular called input. So in order to use a directive, I'm going to say @input. Now, again, I get a red squiggle here. This is because input hasn't been imported yet. This is actually going to come from Angular core, so I can import it up here with this stuff. So if I import input, then now I can use this Angular directive input user. So every single time I create a user now, I'm going to have to pass in one in my app component. Now, I don't have any users created yet, so I'm going to have to go ahead and do that. In my app.module.ts, or sorry, app.component.ts, I'm going to have to create a user. Now, I can do this pretty easily just by saying user equals new user, and I pass in the data that's relevant to it. Now, the data that user is storing, like I said before, is a username. So I'm going to have to give this person a username. Let's give the person the username Smithy, just because I kind of like that. They are going to have the email smith@gmail.com. Don't know who that is, but I'm sure they won't mind. Their name is going to be Agent Smith. And their email, I'm going to say their email was verified. Again, our user is squiggled here just because we haven't imported it yet. So we'll import user from. This time, because we're in our app component.ts, user is actually in the same path. So our relative path this time is going to be /user. All right. We're also getting complaints by tslint actually this time that I should be using single ticks. And what's it complaining about now? I guess I don't know what it's complaining about at this point. Interesting. That might be a false negative. I'm going to assume it's a false negative for now and that's not actually an error. Sometimes the TypeScript linter can be a little bit finicky, and because that's the case, we can't really do much about that. Once I run the code, we'll see if an error actually pops up, but I'm pretty sure that it won't. So let's just keep moving. Okay, back in our user component, user component.ts, we've indicated that we're going to pass in a user, and we have a user in our app component.js, or .ts. So now, back over here, I can actually indicate that I want to pass in a user simply by saying user, and I'll put it in square brackets. This is a way to tell Angular that this is an Angular property and not just an HTML property. And then I'm going to pass in the variable name. So my variable name over in my app component.ts was user. So I'm just going to place that right in there. And now my user component.ts should have that passed in. So to display that data now, though, I'm going to have to put this in the HTML. Now, in Angular, Angular actually has a templating engine where I can access JavaScript variables right here in the HTML. So what I can do is I can say I am user, colon, and then place in my JavaScript variable right here. In order to place in JavaScript variables, all I'm going to have to do is put in a brace and close it with 2 more braces. From within those braces, I just simply call the variable name. This time it's user. And then I'll put in the username. So I am user.username. If there are no errors with this, and hopefully there are not, then I should go over here, restart my Angular project, ng-serve, just like before. And once this is served up, then my project over in Firefox will also reserve itself. Back over in app-component.js, it looks like I am getting an error here. So it says expected 0 arguments, but got 4. That is interesting. Let's look at this. So we have our export class user, constructor with username, email, name, and verified. Did I spell? Oh, there it is. I misspelled constructor. Great catch me. All right. So I'm going to go back over here. This should recompile in my terminal over here. And once it's done compiling, then we'll be able to see what we have done in our browser. All right, compiled successfully, no errors. So back over here in Firefox, we now see that our first component, I am user Smithy. This is showing up here as Smithy because the user that we passed in has that username. The rest of these app user components, though, don't have a user passed into them, so there's nothing to show here for I am user blank. That might be an issue then, right? So we have this user Smithy, but we had to hard code that. And if we just have to keep on putting in a bunch of app users, then we're just repeating a lot of code. And when we repeat a lot of code, then we know we're probably doing something wrong. Repeating code means that we're breaking the dry principle. The dry principle basically just stands for don't repeat yourself. Exactly what we're doing here. So let's go ahead and fix that. Let's go ahead and remove all of that content there and say, how are we going to show a bunch of users at the same time? Well, oftentimes, the best way to do that is to show a list of things, because I can iterate through a list, and when I iterate through a list, I can just do the same thing over and over again and write the same line of code. So why don't we explore that? Back over here in my Angular CLI, in my terminal, beautiful terminal, I'm going to go ahead and generate another component. I'm going to generate a component called userList. And this component should contain a list of users, and I'll display each of those individually. So the command for that, again, is ng generate component user, and this time I'm going to call this user-list. So I hit component user list, hit enter. It's going to create a bunch of stuff. Back over here in my editor, I now have this component over here called the user list component. Now, in my user list component, basically all I'm going to be doing is taking a list of users and trying to display each of those as an individual app user. So let's get started seeing what that looks like. Well, first of all, we're going to have to get a list of users passed in. So just like before, we'll have to import user. Let's do that first this time. I'll say import user from the relative path from here, we're in source app user list, and the directive we're looking for is in source app. So we'll go / user. Now, the other directive we'll want is input. Now, recall we can just place input right here because input is from Java core. The specific type of input we're going to have is going to be at input user list, and this is going to be of type user array. In TypeScript, when we want to make a list of objects, all we do is place these brackets in front of it. So this right here, rather than just being an individual user, will be an entire list of users. Now, having a list of users is actually very powerful for me in Angular because it means I can loop through these. Now, let me show you what a loop looks like in this HTML. So in order to loop through something, I have to create an outer container. So I'll do that. I'll say div, and this I'm just going to give a class name in HTML. This is just essentially describing what this component is here. And this is going to be class container. This will also now be the home of my for loop. Now, anyone unfamiliar with a for loop, essentially what a for loop is going to do is it's going to go through a list of objects, and it's going to do something with each of those objects, making it a perfect candidate for this. In order to write a for loop in Angular, I'm going to write ng_for. This stands for Angular for loop. Then I'm going to say equals, and I'm going to have to declare a variable here. So I'm going to say let user of user list. This user list is the user list back over here. That's the name of this variable. And then this user is going to represent each user in that user list. This user is now going to be something that we have access to within this container. So now what we can do is we can say app-user. So that's that same app user from before, app user. And then we're just going to pass in that user that we have now. So user equals user. Then we close this. And now we actually have a piece of code that says we're going to list out all of the users that we have. Now, back in my app component.html, this is great because now what I can do is I can pass in app list or app user list, close that, and now all I need to do is pass in a list of users. So I'll say user list equals, and I have to pass in a user list. Now, in the interest of time, I actually have a pre-written list of users, but I'll go through how to type a few of those out. In order to create a list and populate it at the same time in Angular, I'm going to go back over to my app component.ts. I'm going to comment out this line, and I'm going to create a user list. In order to create a list and populate in Angular, all I have to do is just put in the square brackets that I put in before. And then from within here, I'm just going to create a bunch of new users. So my first new user can actually just be Smith here. So if I keep it to just this, I have a user list of just Smithy here. I'll go back over to my app component.html. I'll pass in that user list. We should see that it compiles successfully over here. And in fact, it does compile successfully in my terminal down here. I'll go back over to my Angular project in Firefox, and I'm not seeing content. So let's go ahead and see what happened there. In my console, do I have any errors? Ooh, string contains an invalid character. That's interesting. In appcomponent.html. Oh, I see. I forgot a little bracket here. So I forgot to close this bracket. So if I go back over here then, there we go. I have a list of users, and it just contains Smithy. So I see this I am user Smithy. So if I wanted to continue this then, I'll go back into my app.component.ts. and I can paste in a bunch of more users. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to make a comma here. And like I said, I have a bunch of users that I actually pre-wrote for this stream. But you can make up as many as you'd like. So I now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 users. Now that I have 6 users, I'm going to go ahead and save that. You can see in my terminal, everything's compiling. Everything says compiled successfully. Go back over here, and automatically my application is actually just placing more users onto the page. This is finally the power of Angular. This is why we use something like this over just writing static HTML. Now, if I want to add more content here, all I have to do is add more data. And data is so powerful in the modern world. It's everywhere around us. Using tools like Angular as a front-end framework, it allows us to take that data and put it onto a page and most of the times make it beautiful. Right now, we're just here making users show up as plain text, but we can start to actually style some of this stuff. We can actually make this content look nicer and look more succinct. So yeah, let's do that. Let's go ahead and modify some of this user component, and we should start to see some of this content change automatically. So back in my user component, my user is pretty dull. All it has is this, I am a user. I am the user with this username. So let's go ahead and first of all create a new container for each of these users. And we'll give this a class user. So this is a div that's going to contain our user. Then let's just go ahead and create these p tags again. And let's create a p tag for each element. So I'm going to have inside of each of these p tags a element. So I'll say user.username, and then I'll say another p tag, and this will have user.name p user.email, and lastly p user.verified. So now that I've changed this, let's go back over here, and I start to see suddenly a just wall of text. So this might not be quite what I want. Now I have a lot of information here, so I might need something to actually section off some of this stuff. So let's actually start styling some of this. Let's go over here to userComponent.css. Now earlier I mentioned the CSS file is where we're actually going to write styles that will affect how this looks. For our style sheets here, they're going to be scoped. So everything we write inside of this style sheet is only going to apply to our users. So let's go ahead and write some stuff down. So I'm going to write in .user. This is going to apply to every single block that has the user class. In my case, this is going to be this one right here. I'm going to say I want this sectioned off. So I'm going to give this a margin. A margin will be just an amount of space that it pushes all the content around it away. And then I'm going to give this a margin of 5em auto. M is basically a universal unit in web design. And auto is going to say if you're not taking up all the space you can, take up more space. Next, I'm going to give this a border. My border, I'm going to make 2 pixels. I'm going to make it a nice black border. This is the color black here, 0, 0, 0. And I'm going to say that's going to be a solid border. So once I save that, it's going to compile, and then this is going to be applied to my user component. So if I go back over here, I now see that I have these users blocked off. Now, this isn't the prettiest thing ever, and if I wanted to make it look nicer, I could sit here and play with the CSS more. I could maybe give them images that would represent each user. I could probably change the fonts, but for now, I think this is fine for our use, just so that we can succinctly see each individual user and know where one begins and the next one ends. So now that we have that, let's just go ahead and think about this. So we have this app here, and we can see some users. So let's look at some of these. We have Smithy. That's the one we made before. We have me here. I'm a big fan of localhost, so I signed up for the app. We have Dan the Man. Dan's a real cool person. He is the man. And we have a spam bot here. Spam bot named Bob Smith, and their spambot@email.com. That seems suspicious. But more suspicious than any of that, they didn't verify their email. I don't like that there. So maybe it's time I actually add some functionality to my app and make it reactive. I need a way of deleting some of these users. So, how do I go about that? Well, I have a component that's responsible for putting all of these users out. So in that component, why don't I add a delete button to all of these users? Let's do that. Let's go back to the user list component. All right, and I have this list of users. Great. And in the HTML, I'm putting those users down. So why don't I put a button down, and that button will just say delete. If I refresh the page over here, great, I now have a button that says delete. Wonderful. But when I click it, it doesn't actually do anything. Curses, I really want to get rid of this spam bot. Well, because this delete button wasn't actually set to do anything, it just won't do anything. So we're going to have to program the functionality in here. Back over in my code, I'm going to go to the user list component, and I'm going to say that I need to do something when someone clicks this button. In Angular, to indicate that I want to do something when something gets clicked, I'm going to set up some parentheses here, and I'm going to type inside of those parentheses, click. So this is going to say, when this is clicked, I want to do something. Now, what I want to do is I want to delete the user from my list and just remove it from the page. So now I have to actually implement this. So if I go back over to my user list component, I have to actually write this method out, this delete method. Let's do that. So I'm going to say delete user. That user is going to be of type user. And then I am going to say that the return type of this is void. Because I'm updating something, I'm modifying it, I'm mutating it. I usually want those kind of methods to have a void return. So what I need to do now is I need to modify my user list. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to say this.userList. All right, that's the property I'm working with. And I am going to have to filter some content out of this. So I'll use a property that TypeScript actually gives me out of arrays called filter. Now, filter is going to take what's called a callback function. A callback function is just going to be a function where JavaScript is going to run this every single time I have an item go through. So in this case, the filter is going to take my list of users. It's going to go through each user, so I'll pass that in as a variable. And it's going to have to see if I want that item still. If my filter method returns true, then it will keep that item inside of my list. But if the filter method returns false, then it will remove the item from the list. So that means that if I want the item to stay in the list, I have to return false. So in my list here, I have these users. All right. The first item I don't want to remove. And I can tell I don't want to remove it because it's not this user. So maybe I can take advantage of that. I can just say, all right, well, as long as I don't have the same user, then don't remove it. So I can say return that the user that I have here, the one that I'm currently working with, is not the user that I passed in as a parameter. Now, it looks like I made a small mistake here. I actually called this parameter here user, and I also passed in user as the filter parameter. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this. So I'm going to call this filtered user. And same deal as before. So I'm going to say, if the filtered user is not equal to the user that I'm concerned with, keep it in. Once I'm done with that, what's going to happen is it's going to go through each item in my list, see if it's the user, and remove it if it is. So let's go back over here, refresh my page. So now I have a delete button that's actually put onto a method. So when I click on this delete button, I see suddenly that user that I didn't want goes away. So one small disclaimer here before I continue. I said before, this isn't connected to a backend application. So, of course, as soon as I refresh the page, my spam bot is back, and I'll have to remove it again. If you wanted to continue this project and connect it to a backend app, it might be a good idea to not only remove it from this list, but maybe also to remove this from a database on your backend. Basically, this delete function is a little bit superficial right now because all I'm doing is removing it from my front end, and my front end is also providing that. But at the same time, let's look past that and realize that we now have something that's functional, that's reactive. So I was able to click a button, and actually my page reacts to that delete button. And I didn't have to tell my page to remove that HTML. It just got removed automatically because it was being removed from this list. And the list that's feeding that list here knows that it should be removed from my HTML. Angular is just doing all of this magic for us in the background in real time. We can make really fast, responsive apps in not that many lines of code, honestly. So we have the 4 lines of code here. This is our markup. Our delete function is another 4 lines of code, and all of the rest of the code that we've written here, we've written 1 line here. We've essentially written 9 lines of code in order to get this really awesome and really quick piece of functionality. The last thing we might want to do is create just more buttons, more functions, more ways to interact with these users. One such example is I see Jason here hasn't verified his email, but I was on the phone with him and I understand that he actually tried to verify it and it wasn't working. So I, as an admin, am going to flip this over. In order to do that, I'm going to have to create another button. So let's do that now, just real fast. Same kind of deal. I'm going to create a new button. I'm going to say when it's clicked, all right, when this is clicked, I want to verify a user. And I'll just put in the word verify here. Back into my user list.component.ts, I'm going to create a new function here called verify. Verify, it's going to take in a user, and it's going to return a void. Within this, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go through my list, and I'm going to modify it in some way. Now, this time, I'm not filtering something because I'm not removing anything. I'm actually going to use what's called the map function. The map function, so this.userlist.map, is going to go through the same way as the filter function. It's going to go through each user, so mapped user, and it's going to just return some new content. And the list that comes out at the other end is going to be made up of all of the items that I've returned. So here, I'm going to say, basically, I just want to return the users. So I'm going to return mapped user, all right? But before I return that mapped user, I want to say if it's the user I'm looking for. So I'm going to say if user equals the mapped user, then all I want to do is say that the mapped user let's see, it was verified. Yes, verified is the property name. I'm going to set that to true. And then I return that, and I get a new user list that contains all of the new details of the user. So again, I've just written 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines of code over here. I've written inside of my user list component 1 new line of code. I now have this verify function. I'm going to go ahead and delete that spam bot. I'm going to verify JSON, and that flips over to true. Again, in real time, super fast, without us having to really do a lot of work. So if you want to continue with Angular, like I said before, go check out the Angular Tour of Heroes. That's going to be an amazing place for you to go through all of the content that we've done here, plus some more. You'll learn more about Angular routing. You might learn a little bit about testing. Going to read documentation on Karma and Jasmine is also going to help you make some really robust production-level applications. If you want to make your app look a lot nicer than I made my app look here today, then you might want to go check out some projects like Tailwind CSS or Bootstrap CSS in order to actually style this stuff to make it look very nice. And then lastly, the other piece of content you can look up is just more Twitch and YouTube tutorials. Angular has a really great sprawling community full of hundreds of thousands of super talented developers from all over. So that concludes the lesson content that I had for you today. So if there's any questions, then feel free to leave them in the chat. Any concerns about anything I've done here or any demos that you'd like to see, also feel free to put that down. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and commit this stuff to Git and place this on GitHub so that you can all view it at a later time. So over here in my console, I'm just going to say git status. I can see I've made a lot of new stuff here. I'm going to add my source folder, git add src, and I should have more stuff, correct? Doesn't look like it, so I'll say git commit-m. Added content to my demo project. All right. Again, this will be on GitHub for everyone to view at a later time in case you are curious about reviewing the notes. As always, this content will be available on Twitch in a VOD, or it will be available on YouTube in the next couple of days. All right. Okay, well, if there are no questions, then I'm going to sign off for today. Again, this lesson was brought to you by Zip Code Wilmington. Go check us out on our social media, Zip Code Wilmington on Facebook, at Zip Code Wilm on Twitter and Instagram. And follow us on Twitch if you haven't already. Follow us on Facebook. Go check out zipcodewilmington.com and have fun coding. All right. See ya.